I'm going to say a little bit more about two sorts of institutions that were very much part of Methodist life in this period. This is David Lowes Watson's book entitled The Early Methodist Class Meeting, published by Discipleship Resources in 1985 and based on David's Duke University PhD dissertation that he wrote under Frank Baker in the 1980s. What Baker discovered was that these foundational groups, these class meetings, little groups of about 12 people that met, men and women together in parts of the city where they lived, these groups were not groups primarily for describing their own religious experiences. They were not Bible study groups. They were not really prayer groups. What David Lowes Watson showed in his book on the class meeting was that these groups really focused on one specific thing. They focused on keeping the general rules. Now, if you've not read the general rules, you've got to read them. This is a short document that's absolutely foundational. In fact, you could say it's constitutionally foundational for early Methodist groups, both in Britain and then eventually in the United States. What these groups did was they began with prayer. They might begin by singing a verse or two of a hymn, but then they got down to business, and the business was this. They asked each person in the group if they had kept each one of the rules that week. Sister such and such, have you kept the rule that says that you should avoid buying or selling men, women, and children with an intention to enslave them? If Sister such and such said yes, she had kept that rule and avoided practicing the slave trade, they would rejoice over her. If she did not, they would have a word of exhortation for her. And if she persisted in not keeping that rule, they would remove her. Not because they were trying to be mean or something, but because she agreed when she became a Methodist that she would keep those rules. They were fundamental like that. Brother such and such, have you kept the rule that says you will not wear gold or costly apparel? Sister such and such, have you kept the rule that says you will visit the sick and those in prison? Brother such and such, have you kept the rule this week that says you will attend upon the supper of the Lord, the Word of God preached, and so forth, private and family prayer, all those things that are in the general rules? That's what the early Methodist classes accomplished. They held each other accountable for basic elements of Christian discipleship. When I've described this to students in the past, they very often have a kind of surprised reaction and say, well, my goodness, that's more like a 12-step group, Alcoholics Anonymous, or maybe even a weight loss group, a group that just holds you accountable for your basic behaviors. I think that's right. I think that was the genius of these early Methodist class meetings. The band meetings were very different. I don't have a copy of it to show you, but my student Kevin M. Watson has written a book based on a dissertation that he wrote here at SMU under my direction, a book entitled Pursuing Social Holiness, The Band Meeting in Wesley's Thought and Methodist Popular Practice, published by Oxford University Press in 2014. It's a fine study of the band meetings. Dr. Kevin Watson, who is not related at all to David Lowes Watson, who wrote the book on the class meeting, Kevin Watson writes that the band meetings were actually earlier than the Methodist class meetings. They developed out of Moravian practices that John and Charles Wesley had observed. And these really were groups for more intimate fellowship between Christians. They involved division of a society into men and women, married people and single people. So there would be typically 4 bands in any Methodist society: single men, single women, married men, married women. John Wesley believed that people could speak more openly in a group like that. And he encouraged them to confess their sins to each other, to discuss their trials, to ask how it had been with their souls during the previous week. And they were functionally prayer groups as well as sharing groups for these early Methodist people. Kevin Watson makes the point that this may be even more relevant perhaps than the class meetings today, because so many people today are looking for a sense of intimate connection, and these band meetings really gave people that sense of intimate connection together. The bands and the societies were both, the bands and the class meetings were both part of the local society, which, as I say, typically met quarterly only for the celebration of the love feast in early Methodist life. So there was a series of Anglican institutions that were accepted by the early Methodists within which they practiced their Christian faith. They didn't have to replicate those until much later when they became a church. There was a series of lay-led institutions, classes, bands, societies, and they were fairly self-propagating. It was the lay class leader who admitted people to the class and to the band, who would give them a ticket to admit them to the love feast. It was the stewards of the societies who were the local governors of the Methodist societies, and they could carry on their life without necessarily having ordained ministers or preachers around. There was another set of institutions that had to do with the Methodist preachers, the preaching institutions. Those were the institutions of lay preaching, itinerant preaching, occasionally outdoor preaching, though in the past I think we've maybe exaggerated the extent to which Wesley and the early Methodist preachers preached out of doors. There were some recorded instances of that, but I think more often it was in private homes, halls that they had rented for the purpose, things like that. Then they developed from 1744 the Conference of Preachers, originally just ordained ministers, and then they voted at that first conference to admit the lay preachers to the Conference of Preachers, and increasingly developed circuits and appointed superintendents over circuits to regularize the life and the itinerant preaching of these Methodists. Now, one thing we've got to say about itinerancy in this period is it doesn't simply mean that you're appointed to a different church every year. What itinerancy really meant was you preach in a different place not only every week, but sometimes 3 or 4 times a week you would preach in a different location. These Methodist itinerant preachers really did move around from place to place preaching. Eventually, by the later decades of John Wesley's life, we're going to combine some of those institutions together. The Anglican institutions, the lay-led institutions, the preaching institutions, and that's what's going to give the shape of the polity or the organization of the early Methodist Episcopal Church. But we've got some more to consider about John Wesley's theology and other matters along the way. So I'm going to leave off here. This has been Lecture 06 on John Wesley and Methodist connections. Thank you.